chapter 10. Matthew 10. A couple of people this morning have asked me about what kind of shirt I got on. And I just want to show you. We got this one and got James one that matches it. And when we were down there, we all went out to eat, and James and I wore our shirts. And I don't know how many grandpas I heard say, "I want one of them. Get me one of them." So I thought I'd wear it this morning. Matthew chapter 10, verse 29. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. Now, some say knowledge. Some say without him being aware. I like the way the NIV put that, outside the Father's care. And even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. I think if we understood our worth, we would probably be astounded at the worth that God places on you. That person sitting next to you. Oh, not the one that's right up against you. It's the one that's a long way from you. Because the one that's right up against us, we normally, they're precious. They're worth everything. Especially if you're 25 and under. I mean, they're worth everything. I'm talking about the person you hardly know that's down on the other end of your row. How much they're worth to God. If you had any idea, you'd want to be their best friend. Because God believes in you. And they, meaning each one of you, are worth a ransom. Tremendous amount. One of the reasons that we often do not receive, or things that cause us not to receive the blessings that God offers to us, is because we don't see ourselves with worth. We don't see that we have talent or intellect, or that we're even worthy to receive those kinds of things. Whether it might be a dream, a hope, or just a general blessing, even a healing. Sometimes we don't feel that we're deserving of those things. And we have a hard time coming to grips about that. Now, there's a few that's on the other end that believe they deserve everything. I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about you. Those who really don't know their worth to God. When God gives a dream or a desire or a blessing, and it's offered by heaven, it is useless unless there's a receptor. If there's no receptor, in other words, if nobody receives it, that blessing goes unused. And it means nothing. So not every blessing or dream that's offered by God is received by the one that it's intended for. Too many of us cannot see the worth within ourselves that we might move into that place of blessing because we fear the outcome or the process of grasping that blessing or that dream. Young ladies have a very poor self-image. Young men, they have a hard time believing that they can accomplish anything. And some of you that for years, you've been struggling to find your place. And nothing seems to be working out exactly right. God, all this time, has been trying to pour out more and more of Himself. And we're just not receiving it and walking in it and using it. It kind of reminds me of the children of Israel. God offered His people, His children that were in the wilderness, a humongous blessing. He communicated it very clearly. He repeated it. He reinforced it with miracles, yet they didn't accept it. He told Abraham, He told Isaac, He told Jacob, and all the way down, He told His people, I'm going to give you the promised land. I'm going to bless you above every other nation. And because of you, every other nation's going to be blessed. So the day comes, Moses walks in and says, Pharaoh, let my people go. God said so. And we know that there was plague after plague after plague after plague because Pharaoh was saying, nope, not going to happen. Until finally, the firstborn of everything in Egypt died. Down in the land of Goshen, those who had painted blood upon the doorpost in obedience to God, none of their people died. So finally, get out of here. And they were giving them gold. They were giving them precious stones. They were giving them all of these just things that were valuable. Just get out of here. We don't want you anymore. And it says that they came out with much stuff. God brought them to the Red Sea. Pharaoh's army had a change of heart and they were coming to kill them. And all of a sudden the sea opens up and they all walk across on dry land. And then Pharaoh decides, well, they do it, we can do it. And they started it and that's the quick version. I've thought about recording a quick version of the Bible. Adam and Eve, where are you? I'm hiding. The water falls in. David sings. Jesus walks. He dies. And he's coming back one day. The Bible in 30 seconds. People that see this online or whatever, they're saying, what? Who is this guy? God God said, I'm going to give you the promised land. The children of Israel, they all happy. They dancing on the far side of the Red Sea, and they're playing their tambourines and having a grand old time. And they march, took about a week, over to Kadesh Barnea, right on the threshold of going into the promised land. They take a vote. 10-2. We can't do this. And right at the very door, the Israelites rejected the promised land, rejected the blessing, rejected what God had promised. And they turned back to the desert, and for 40 years they wandered in the desert. And then died. Only Joshua and Caleb, out of all of that entire generation, proved worthy and faithful to what God had said. The dream that they had had on the inside, that coincided with that heavenly vision that God had spoken of an entire generation. We're talking millions. 40 years. Joshua and Caleb were the only ones. They alone kept that dream alive. And when the way was cleared and all the cowardly had died, Joshua got a nation and Caleb got a mountain. That had been on their heart since the day they walked into the promised land to spy it out. Caleb had said, hey, Josh, I want that mountain. That's mine. And Joshua said, you can have that mountain. I want that nation. So these two guys thought big, but they were serving a very big God. Faith, not fear, sees and receives the worth of dreams and keeps them nourished when all reason would dictate otherwise. It might look absolutely impossible. This could never happen. There's no way that this can happen. But faith, that dream that God plants down in your spirit, man, it begins to nourish, and it keeps that dream alive, that hope alive, that vision alive until it comes to pass. Everything's saying it'll never happen, it'll never happen, it'll never happen. But you're giving birth to it. I like it when doctors don't know what's going to happen. They say, you're never going to have a baby. little while down the road, it's like, boing, guess what? Or the doctor says, you're going to die. And they walk out. Never sick again. I love it when God steps in and says, I'm going to change all of this. Two desperate guys that's in construction got all of their money in this little project, and a rainstorm is coming and it's going to destroy everything. And the naysayers around the edge saying, y'all going to lose it all. And one of them says, in the name of Jesus, you'll not rain on this. And I promise you, a quarter of a mile away, a curtain of rain that you can't even see through, it parts and goes around us, and a quarter of a mile behind us, it comes back together and continues on its way. And there was 3 drops. We had poured a driveway that was huge. It was like an interstate highway. This dude had some money. And it was a big old circular drive. It was, 300 yards long, something like that. Every penny that we had, we put into that project. And if it got rained on and ruined, we would be ruined. We'd lose everything because we'd have to make it right. 3 drops is all we could find. And I looked closely. Oh, I had a spell. You know, back in the old days, you used to have a Holy Ghost spell. And I had one. I loved it. God is awesome. It's fear that sees the possibility. No, fear loses the possibility. It's faith that sees the possibility. I'm in my moment. Don't worry about me. I'll get better. So Paul comes to a point and says, I'm not disobedient to what God has called me to do. I'm not disobedient to that heavenly vision that God has shown me, that dream that He's put down inside of me. There was challenges that he had to overcome. There was obstacles that were thrown in his way. There was reasons, there was opportunities for him to quit and go home. And he said, I can't. I need to be faithful. Look at what potentially had to quit. The potential hindrances, the difficult circumstances that he had to overcome. God must have given him a more than adequate faith and strength to go through the more than average trials that that man had to go through. But I'm here to tell you, he always will. If God calls you to do something that's difficult, He'll give you the faith, He'll give you the strength, He'll give you the wisdom and every tool you need to be able to accomplish that. God will never leave you, nor will He forsake you. If He calls you to do something, He equips you perfectly to be able to do it. You'll never stand alone. 2 Corinthians 11, 23 and 28 says, I labored hard, imprisoned often, beaten times without number, often in danger of death. 5 times I received 40 lashes -1. 3 times I was beaten with rods, stoned once. 3 times shipwrecked, spent a night and day in the open sea, constantly on the move, in dangers from rivers, in dangers from bandits, in dangers from my own countrymen, in dangers from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false brethren. I've labored and I've toiled. I've gone without sleep. I've known hunger and thirst. I have been cold and naked. Who's got a pedigree like that? None of us. Yet, he went through all of that and even more. And then Paul says, these are the small print in my life. These are the light afflictions. Those minor things that have happened to me. He didn't see these as big things. We do, because we love our comfort sometimes more than we love God. Paul went through all of that stuff. How? How did he go through all of that? He had that great dream. He had that vision, and he knew his worth to God. His dream was more valuable than the small print of his life. It was more important to him to put a smile on the face of God than to have self-comforts. He could be joyful and faithful because God's call on his life gave him value and gave him worth. He says, I'm worth more to God alive than dead. So for the time being, I don't worry about nothing. Then there came that moment, and he says, now I'm worth more to God dead than I am alive. And I fought my fight, the good fight of faith. I have kept that faith. I have run my race. He knew that his time was up and that God was carrying him home. But until that moment, there wasn't a person or a thing on the face of the planet that could take him off from it, because God wanted him here. What is your worth to God? Why has he planted you here? What dream has he dropped into your heart? All of those things are valuable to God and to you. So let's look at worth. Something that does not fulfill its purpose is of very little value. How many of you have ever bought some junk? You hear the spiel on television, and then that announcer says, but wait, we'll double your order. So you get 2 pieces of junk instead of 1. You get it home. You plug it in. Nothing. You get one of those grinder upper chopper things. Put a carrot in there and it goes ding. It won't even chop a carrot. So you read the directions, and it says, be sure to chop your carrots finely before putting them in. If I got to do all of that, what do I need this thing for? You can get your money back. So you send it back to them. 6 months later, they hadn't received it. And neither have you. You buy something that doesn't work, that doesn't fulfill its purpose, that doesn't do what they say, that's of very little value. And it'll never be worth the price you paid for it. I don't remember what it was, but there was something that my dad bought. He felt like he needed it. I do not remember what it was. I remember it was junk. It didn't work. And everybody tiptoed around the house because my dad was livid. And I remember at the supper table, that's when all the neat things happened around the Lewis household, was at the supper table. I remember at the supper table, Dad was just complaining. He was carrying on. He was yeah. And Mom put her hand up. You'd have to know my mom. And Dad hushed and looked at her. She said, well, at least you can use it for a boat anchor. You've been needing one. Whatever it was, and I do not remember, he used it for a boat anchor. And it worked pretty good. Something that does not fulfill its purpose is of very little value and will not be worth the price paid for it. Look at yourself for just a moment. Are you fulfilling your purpose in the kingdom of God? Are you doing what God's called you to do? You say, well, I try. No, that's not my question. Are you fulfilling your purpose? Because that which will not fulfill its purpose is of very little value and not worth the price that's paid. Do you realize what was paid for you? When Jesus died upon a cross, He purchased you. We are bought with a price, that not of ourselves, lest we should boast. The blood that was shed for me and you. Are you fulfilling your purpose? Think for a moment with me. A rubber band that will not stretch is useless. There's one right there. If a rubber band won't stretch, what good is it? Seriously, think about it. A rubber band is not effective unless it's stretched. It won't hold anything in place if it doesn't stretch. But when it stretches and then it comes back together, it'll hold a bundle or it'll hold something together. That same thing is true of me and you. Paul's dream that God had placed down inside of him, it stretched him. It enlarged him so that he could meet the purpose. That God-given blessing helped him to become what he would never have become without that. It was worth it. Read that last little statement of his. He said, now there's laid up for me a crown. And he said, it's been worth it. Elisha walked with Elijah. And there was a dream that was born down in his spirit. He watched what Elijah was doing. And he walked with him all of those 3 years. And he watched everything that he did. And little by little, this thing down inside of him grew bigger and bigger and stronger until it came the moment in 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 9. Elijah was going back and Elisha was walking with him, and Elijah kept telling him, you stay here. And he said, I'm not staying. I'm going with you. So Elijah turned around and said to Elisha, ask, what may I do for you? What do you want me to do before I'm taken away from you? And Elisha said, please, let me have a double portion of your spirit upon me. I want twice what you got. I want twice as much. And he was really saying to God, God, give me twice as much. And God's saying, can you handle it? You've seen what he's gone through. You know the story about the brook Cherith. You know how Ahab wanted to kill him, how Jezebel wanted to kill him. You've heard his story. Are you ready for that? And Elisha was saying, twice as much, Lord. I want twice as much for you. Amen. Not of you, for you. You see, me and you, we want twice as much of him because that means twice as much blessing. Elisha said, I want twice as much for you. That meant twice as much work. What are we looking for? Are we looking for a chance to be used? Are we looking for a chance for God to put His hand inside of us and touch a nation? Or are we just wanting it all for ourselves? Elijah looks at Elisha and said, man, you've asked a hard thing. You don't understand what you're asking for. It stretched him all the way to death. But that dream, that goal, that desire that was down inside of Elisha, it was fulfilled. What he had asked God came to pass, just as he had asked. It was worth it. Was Elisha tested? You better believe it. He was stretched out of shape. Oh, he was pulled in every direction. But it all came about. Most people, most of us, we try to avoid stretching, don't we? We see that as trial and hardship. We don't see it as being used by God. So we try to avoid the stretching. That's why God often has to bring some kind of motivation to us. Sometimes it's motivation. And He has to do it before we'll stretch. We won't do it naturally because we shy away from it. I don't know about you, but I don't like hardship. I don't like to go through trials. But sometimes that's a part of the stretching. John F. Kennedy tells the story, and I've read it several different times in several different books. It's put most succinctly by Bill Bennett. Wrote a book on moral something, and it's in that book. And Susan bought me those books years ago, and it goes like this. It was a story about his grandfather, Thomas Fitzgerald, who grew up in Ireland, and in the country in Ireland they had stone fences that was made of just the jagged stone that they had cleared out of the fields. And it separated the people's fields one from another. And when he was a little boy, Thomas Fitzgerald Kennedy, he enjoyed so much with his friends. They would go out and they would climb across these walls, and they would run in the fields. And he was the smallest one. And it was really, really difficult for him to be able to get up and over these walls. And all the other boys would call him sissy and call him names. So he learned a little trick. He had a favorite cap that he wore all the time. So when he got to one of these big fences that he needed to crawl over, he would take his cap off and throw it on the other side. Then he had to go. He had to make it. He couldn't quit. He couldn't not go over that mountain or that wall. Sometimes you and I have to come to the place where we stretch ourselves more, where we have to try harder, and our actions will put the enemy on notice. You're not going to defeat me. I don't care how hard it is. I'll climb the mountains that I have to climb. I'll go through the valleys that I have to go through and cross the deserts that I have to go across, because I'm going to do what God has asked me to do. That purpose that's down inside of me, I'm going to see it to the very end. I'm not giving up and I'm not quitting. And we have to throw our caps across so that we'll go. Whatever we do, we intend to succeed for God. There's something important there for us. That motivation. Some runners, they hit the wall and they make it through. And they say, on the other side of the wall, and if you've ever ran any distance, you know exactly what the wall is. It is almost like a wall. And when you're running and your breath is leaving your lungs and your lungs are fighting for some little grasp of air and the wall is right there. When you make it past that wall and you break through it, there's a feeling of ecstasy. That feeling of joy, that feeling of peace. And once again, you can catch your stride and you can begin to run with fervor once again. Even though you're exhausted, you're past that wall. God is calling for you and me to bust through that wall. Whatever it is that's holding you back. Whatever it is that makes you feel unworthy. Whatever your friends have said, whatever your family has said, whatever you've said to yourself, whatever's happened, whatever you've done. Whatever it is that stands between you and that destiny. It's time to break through. It's time to go on. You are worth it, and it is worth it. Just as a rubber band is more likely to break when it's stretched to its limits, sometimes the same is true when we stretch toward our God-given blessing. That which God has dropped into us. That's a moment of being vulnerable. It's a moment when your dream, your desire, your blessing that God is giving you is making you stretch. Most of the time, if a runner's going to fall, it's when he's right at the tape and he's stretching for it. He's going for it with all that's in him. It's at that moment he might stumble. That's the moment of difficulty. And he might fall. And it would slip through his fingers at that moment. You're stretching for it. And you go down. That vulnerable moment. Listen to me. Every person who has ever stretched has been tempted to give up because they hit that moment of discouragement. Every one of you. Anybody in here, when you've really stretched yourself, you've hit that moment of discouragement and what's the use? Why try? I can't do this. King David probably got to that moment. He had blown it so many times. The discouragement began to invade him. But to his credit, he threw it off and he said, no, I'm not quitting. His son was in rebellion and had run him out of his kingdom. His son had gone to bed with his wife, David's wife, to humiliate him throughout all of the country. Even though at that moment he felt like his dream was slipping through his fingers. He was up in age. He was stretching for the finish line. The truth dawned on him. If I stop stretching, if I quit right now, then all the people around me is going to stop stretching too. Those that are watching me, those that mean so much to me. If I quit, they're going to quit. If I don't stretch, they're not going to stretch. Some of you young people, some of you moms and dads, if you quit, you got friends that are watching you. They'll quit too. You got children that are watching you. They'll quit too. I'll never forget what one of my cousins said to me. He looked at me and he said, Bernie Lewis, if what you're saying is not real and what you're doing is a fluke, I'll kill you. I'm having to go to church. I had to quit smoking. I had to quit drinking. If what you're doing is not real, I'm going to hurt you. That was years and years ago. For 40 years, I've heard him say that. So I've had to stay true. That's my cap that I've thrown. I can't quit. Because if I quit, they'll quit. If I quit, some of you might quit. I can't quit. I got to keep stretching. Don't you stop. It's worth it. You're worth it. They're worth it. Well, how can I feel so useless. David in 1 Samuel chapter 30 verse 6 says, David encouraged himself in the Lord. When you start stretching, I've learned that sometimes you quit praying because all of your efforts going into that stretch. You stop praying. You stop having that precious time with God. It takes second place. You're too busy in doing what you're doing. And you forget to nourish. You forget to let God pour into you. David encouraged himself in the Lord. You have to take time for that. Why? Because you're worth it. It's worth it. He's worth it. Bow your heads with me, would you please?